So thanks everyone who's introduced themselves in the chat. I welcome everybody to continue chatting about interests, sharing concerns, having a conversation there. That would makes it a little bit more interactive and lively this evening. Before we get fully started, I would like to make a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory and in the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others, whose stewardship of the land, waters, and resources continues to shape our work, both through partnerships and through their leadership. I'd also like to acknowledge that our discussion this evening is not taking place just in Edmonton, but is focused on the entire Eastern Slopes, which covers the treaty areas of Treaty 6, 7, and 8. And the areas have been cared for by Indigenous peoples and stewarded since time immemorial. These areas also continue to be used for cultural and traditional practices by First Nations and Métis from across Alberta and beyond the provincial borders. I would invite everyone just now who's joining us this evening to take a moment and reflect and acknowledge about the lands that you are joining us from. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tara Russell. I'm the program director for the CPAWS Northern Alberta chapter, and I'll be your host for tonight's presentation and Q&A. Kira, do you mind advancing the slides? So a little bit of our agenda tonight. I'm going to introduce you to our staff members, give you a Zoom little housekeeping thing because we're joining from a webinar this evening and not a meeting. It's a little bit different. And then we're going to get into a couple of very short presentations with some updates on where we are in coal mining and a little bit more about why we feel a strong coal policy is important. And then we'll have ample time for some Q&A. So tonight you can see all of our panelists. Because we're a Zoom webinar, these are the only faces you'll be able to see this evening. Everybody else's videos are off. And we're going to be hearing from Katie Morrison, who's the Executive Director from the CPAWS Southern Alberta chapter, as well Chris Smith, our Conservation Analyst from the Northern Alberta chapter, is going to be presenting to you. We're also joined by Benjamin Missener, who's going to be available to answer questions in the chat and Q&A at the end. And who I think's video is going to remain off for the evening, but he's still there, no worries. And of course, this event would absolutely not be happening without the miracle behind the scenes workers, Hira Shaw, the communications manager at CPAWS Southern Alberta, and Elise, who is joining us from our CPAWS Northern Alberta office. So thank you, team. We're here to help out with any technical issues. You'll see them pop into the chat and answer questions, etc. So we're all here for you. Next slide here. So like I mentioned, this is a Zoom webinar, not a meeting. So everybody's going to be on mute and you don't have a video option for this. Just a reminder that we don't tolerate any harassment or rudeness. You'll just immediately be taken out of the meeting. Not that I ever expect that from our CPAWS supporters and attendees. At the end, we are going to have a Q&A. We're going to hopefully keep that a little bit more interactive. I see that most of you have found the chat. That can be found at the bottom of the screen, and you can interact with everybody there. We also have the raise hand function, and we can use that during the Q&A. If you would like to ask your question out loud, you can click raise hand. I'll call on you and ask you to unmute, and you can ask a question that way. And as well, we have the Q&A function. So as we're going through the presentations, or at the end during the Q&A period, you can select that and you can submit a question that way. Our staff will either answer it in the chat, so you can check and see if answers have been provided in writing, or I will ask them out loud to our panelists and mark them as answered. So keep checking in there and don't be afraid to put questions in. And just as a reminder, we are recording this, so hopefully for people that missed out on this evening can still access the recording later. We'll be posting it on our social media and YouTube channels. So without further ado, Katie Morrison is going to give us a little bit of a catch up on coal in 2021. And boy, has it been busy. So Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, catch up in 2021 with a little bit of body text, which we clearly didn't catch in our review of our slides. But if you want to move on to the next slide, I'll start that review. So a few things that happened at the federal level. The Government of Canada announced that their intent to end thermal coal production in Canada. And as part of this, suggested that the Vista mine expansion would likely not be found in the public interest. So Vista is currently, deciding whether they will move forward with that, and we'll see how that rolls out. But a clear intention from the federal government, at least on thermal coal. The minister around the same time also indicated that all new metallurgic coal projects in the country would be required to have a federal impact assessment. I think there's a little bit of a clause to that, which I'll talk about in a second when I talk about the designation of Tent Mountain. But they made this statement, and we'll be looking to the new environment minister to restate this and put it somewhere in sort of a public policy written format, so that it can actually be upheld and move forward. The next thing that happened at a federal, this is not in chronological order, but another thing that happened at the federal level and under federal jurisdiction is the rejection of the Grassy Mountain mine. So this past spring, the Grassy Mountain coal project was found not in the public interest by both the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, or by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change at the federal level. Based on the findings of the joint review panel through the hearing process and the environmental impact assessment process, that adverse impacts of the project, including effects on surface water quality, habitat for species at risk, would be too great to be outweighed by what they called the low to moderate economic benefits of the project. And they also noted that it was likely to result in significant adverse effects to physical and cultural heritage for 3 Treaty 7 First Nations. So, I think this really sets the tone and expectation for any future proposals in this region, given that these proposed projects would all face the same water quality challenges and occur in areas of critical habitat for species at risk. We know that Benga is applying to appeal this decision. So they have to apply to appeal, and if they are granted that, then they can actually do the appeal. So they are in the application to appeal stage at both the provincial and federal level. And at least at the provincial level, we'll hear later in December, is my understanding, whether they are granted that permission to appeal. And then the fourth sort of update from a federal level, a federal jurisdiction level, was the designation of the Tent Mountain project for federal assessment. So this was a request for a federal impact assessment initiated by the Kainai and Siksika First Nations and supported by many other groups based on the impact to areas of federal jurisdiction. So including effects on transboundary environments, Indigenous peoples, fish and fish habitat, and the uncertainty related to the effectiveness of proposed measures to avoid selenium contamination and other contamination of water. They also took into account public concern related to these effects and adverse impacts on Aboriginal and treaty rights. And those are the things they highlight because those are the areas that the federal government has jurisdiction and has decision-making power over. So this means, sort of, that Moncton will have to complete both a provincial and federal impact assessment, and that would likely be combined. Although we now have some questions on that designation based on an information session that was held by the Impact Assessment State Agency of Canada today, that an impact assessment is not actually guaranteed for Tent Mountain. They just will be assessing whether an impact assessment is required for Tent Mountain. And that for me calls into question the whole commitment made by the previous Minister of Environment around all metallurgic coal projects being designated for federal assessment. That in fact, that may not be true. It may just be that they will look at them to see whether they need a federal assessment, and that's a really different commitment. And so I think we'll need to push the new Minister of Environment and Climate Change on that to remake that commitment and really provide clarity on what that commitment is. And so, you know, Moncton is moving forward on the Tent Mountain project, and you know there was some media around the hydrogen energy proposal, and I won't get into that now, but we can talk a little bit about that in the questions if people have questions. But we'll be moving forward, working through that process. Comments on the project description, which will be part of the federal government's assessment of whether it requires a federal assessment, are due December 16th. So we'll be participating in that. I'm sure a lot of you folks as well. Next slide, please. Provincial developments. I feel like things have slowed down a little bit, but there was a time when every day I felt like there was a new context or a new provincial development. But for the year in sum, you know, we started off the year with massive public pressure pushing back on the rescission of the coal policy and the exploration that was happening in the Category 2 areas. And due to, you know, probably the work of a lot of you folks and that overwhelming public pressure, the Minister of Energy reinstated the coal policy. And as part of that, stopped leases in Category 2, but this still left Category 4 open to all exploration and development activities. So that was a concern for us from the beginning on the reinstatement of the coal policy. The coal policy, while it was progressive for its time, really was outdated. Those Category 4 areas are not any less culturally important or ecologically sensitive. And so just reinstating the coal policy is not a solution to the coal issue. So we need a new coal policy, and we need the completion of comprehensive land use planning, which is something that we have been waiting for over a decade. The coal, oh, can you go back a slide, please? Yeah, thanks. The next piece in that was that the government put together the Coal Policy Committee to engage Albertans on the issue of coal development. This Coal Policy Committee has spent 6 months engaging largely with stakeholder groups and are writing 2 reports, so the What We Heard report and recommendations to the government report. So the Coal Policy Committee isn't writing the policy, it has no decision-making power. They're writing these 2 documents to the government. These were originally due October 15th and November 15th, but they've both been given an extension to submit those to the government by December 31st. The Minister of Energy says that she will be reviewing them thoroughly before releasing them to the public. So we will definitely be pushing to have that released sooner rather than later. And the other piece on the Coal Policy Engagement Committee or Coal Policy Committee engagement was that they did really focus on stakeholder engagement. And while I think that seemed fairly thorough based on what's been posted on the public website, it was not a thorough public consultation. And I think the government still must conduct a comprehensive public consultation on the development of any new coal policy and use both of those pieces, the committee's reports and a thorough public consultation to draft a new policy. And then the next piece that happened in the spring was that one of the first acts of the Coal Policy Committee was to convince the Minister of Energy to put a moratorium on coal exploration in Category 2. And as I mentioned before, we believe that this should have included all coal development activities in Categories 3 and 4 as well, but it was an important step to the temporary halt the damage in some areas. They also paused lease sales in Category 2. However, we found this fall that companies were still transferring lease applications, or in other words, selling them to each other this summer, which wasn't strictly prohibited under the directive from the minister, but it's certainly against the spirit or in the intent of the pause of lease sales and activity in these areas while we discuss the future of coal or not in this province. So that exploration moratorium was actually due to expire December 31st, and we were starting to get a little bit worried about that. Because that would have allowed companies to restart or start applying for new exploration programs after December 31st. But when the minister extended the deadline for the submissions from the Coal Policy Committee, she also extended this moratorium indefinitely. So that was positive, but it really needs to be extended to apply to all lands and become a permanent ban on exploration as part of the new coal policy. Next slide, please. So engagement summary, I mentioned the Coal Policy Committee has done this engagement. Based on the submissions posted on the public website, the vast majority of stakeholders, with the exception of coal companies, lobby groups, and some individuals, were opposed to new coal mines. This was also reflected in the survey that the government rolled out in April, that indicated that 90% of Albertans believe that there are places that should be off limits to coal. So, we'll be really watching that the two documents from the Coal Policy Committee reflect this, reflect what has been posted on their public website. And if not, that they are going to need some real clear reasons why not. And as I mentioned, then also putting it to the government to hold an actual government-led public consultation. Our recommendations to the Coal Policy Committee and what we recommend for the new coal policy is that there is no further coal exploration or development in the eastern slopes of Alberta, including expansion of existing operations. That existing thermal and metallurgic coal mine operations will be permitted to reach the end of their lives, but they must meet all provincial and federal guidelines and regulations in the meantime. And during operations post-closure and post-reclamation. Reclamations of lands served by coal exploration activities must be reclaimed within the next 5 years, next 4 years. And those reclamation costs should be covered in full by the companies and not fall to the taxpayers. We have this gap that there is no bond posted for reclamation of exploration, and so that could be hard to enforce. But that is part of the obligations based on their exploration permits. And then ultimately that comprehensive land use planning, including cumulative effects assessment and threshold planning, needs to be conducted for this entire region. If we had done this 10 years ago, based on the land use planning timelines, I don't think we would be in this situation right now, because those assessments likely would have shown that there's not room for new coal anywhere in this region, and it would have been dealt with at that land use planning level. I will leave it there, but also happy to answer questions on any of that at the end after Chris talks a little bit more.
All right.
Thanks so much, Katie. Sorry, Chris, just a reminder, everybody, I'm seeing some good conversations in the chat because it's so busy. If you do have a question that you'd like one of our staff members to answer, please put it in the Q&A box, just because I'm going to lose track of everything that's going on in the chat. I've also seen Chris and Ben are doing a good job of answering questions there that have already been placed. As well, at the end, you can hold on to your question, raise your hand, and ask it out loud. So thanks for that little interlude, and I'll let Chris take it away.
All right, thanks, Tara, and thanks, Katie. So why is a strong coal policy important? So when the coal policy was created, or the original coal policy back in 1976, as Katie was saying, certain lands were set aside as too environmentally sensitive for open pit coal mining, while other areas that had some previous small scale mining activities were left open for potential future mining. However, these lands and waters, in a lot of cases, were no less culturally or ecologically valuable than the surrounding lands, and our understanding of that value has only grown since that original policy was put into place. So it's now 45 years after the original coal policy's creation, and the current coal policy is honestly unable to adequately address the more complex nature of human use on the eastern slopes today. I mean, a lot has happened in 45 years since that original policy was drafted. These uses have grown in volume, type, and intensity over the years, including the expansion of industrial activities like forestry, agriculture, oil, and gas development, but also along with a wide variety of recreational pursuits. Of note, the scale of many of the current coal mine proposals are substantially larger than what formerly was proposed and developed in Alberta in decades past. And the general footprints of these mines are much larger than a lot of the historic small mines that existed in Alberta. Our communities, agriculture and food production, tourism and recreation all rely on these landscapes existing in as intact a state as possible, basically allowing our mountain watersheds to continue providing all downstream users with clean water. As well as climate change continues to impact the flows, abundance, and availability of water throughout Alberta. This increasingly at-risk limited resource is critical for us to protect now, both for the benefit of our current and future generations of Albertans. So this gets us to the second point, that unabated coal development and consumption are some of the key drivers in increased carbon emissions globally. Canada's forests, grasslands, wetlands, and oceans are part of the climate change solution through their ability to absorb and retain greenhouse gas emissions. The use of coal, both for energy generation as well as for steelmaking, are significant sources of global greenhouse gas emissions, both through land disturbance, but predominantly also through the burning of said coal. Also, as Katie had mentioned, recent federal government announcements have highlighted that Canada is working to move away entirely from thermal coal use, both domestically and for export, no later than 2030. As for metallurgical coal, existing mines internationally, in many cases, have sufficient reserves to cover, depending on how the projections go, demand out to 2050. And mitigating the worst harms associated with climate change leaves really no room for new coal mines or mine extensions. And this was carried out through the International Energy Agency, IEA, on a report they released earlier this year highlighting as such. What was the other one? Also recent research and development into new carbon-free electric and hydrogen methods of steelmaking also brings into question the long-term viability of metallurgical coal projects and raises the possibility that newly proposed coal mines could be at risk of becoming stranded assets as the world moves away from coal. Ultimately, above all else, conservation and community values must be protected. A challenge with metallurgical coal mining is that coal reserves in Alberta occur predominantly in the major headwater basins of our province. The quantity, quality, and location of water used by coal industry operations has a significant possibility of degrading the ecological integrity of local watersheds and negatively impacting wildlife and downstream users that rely on that water. One of North America's top experts on pollution from coal mines, Dennis Lemley, in 2019, concluded that the Provincial Alberta Energy Regulator had failed to seriously assess and guard against environmental pollution from mines in our province. There are also several known incidents of coal mining contamination within Alberta, both historic and in some cases ongoing. We have seen tailing dam failures, such as the Obed mine in Hinton back in 2013, as well as ongoing selenium contamination of native fish populations in the Gregg and McLeod rivers from leftover historic mine contamination of the Cheviot mine near Hinton. Next slide, please. So this gets us to the need for a new coal policy. Sort of how do we improve things and where do we go from here? So we believe that a new, stronger coal policy is needed to provide a vision and modern guidance for how Alberta approaches coal development along the eastern slopes. And we have distilled our recommendations to roughly 5 key points, although there are many other issues that are raised, that we raised as well. I'll just briefly go through these. So first is that no further coal exploration or development occurs on the eastern slopes of Alberta, including the expansion of existing operations. Existing thermal and metallurgical coal operations should be permitted to run to the end of their lives, but contingent on the fact that they follow all existing and proposed water quality guidelines for the duration of operations post-closure and post-reclamation. Reclamation of lands disturbed by coal exploration activities must be reclaimed by companies no later by the end of 2025. The closure and reclamation of mines no longer in operation should occur as soon as possible. And kind of, again, circling back to the real need for comprehensive land use planning in Alberta. It's long been recognized as something that is needed to really address the multiple stresses on our land base and to prevent conflict between different land uses. The tools to accomplish this already exist under the Alberta Land Use Framework. And ongoing regional planning work really needs to be completed in a much more timely manner so we can avoid some of these issues that we're running into now with the recession and then the reimplementation of the original coal policy. Next slide. Yeah, so that is all I have for my update. Anybody else has anything to add? If not, we can segue into the question and answer section of this.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. This is great to have these small presentations to set us all up. And that gives us a nice amount of time to have a question and answer period. So we have, we've gotten lots of questions in the Q&A box. And I see that Ben has jumped in and answered a large number of them for us here. So I would invite anyone now to go into the question and answer box, submit your question. Alternatively, you're welcome to raise your hand and I can call on you. Again, I see that there's lots of activity in the chat and I would just remind you to, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A box because I can't keep up. So thanks so much. Okay. Let's go. I believe also, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you see a question that you like in the Q&A box, I think you can like or dislike it and it ranks them. And if I'm crazy, then don't do that and ignore me. Let's take one from the audience first there. I see Laura Myers has her hand up and I won't leave you hanging there. So I'm going to let you talk. Oh, Laura, you're going to have to put your hand back up so I can click allow you to talk. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I admin the Facebook page Protect Alberta's Rockies and Headwaters, and I just became aware of this whole issue with the tent mountain not necessarily going to a federal review today. So we're going to put together a post, and we need to know exactly what kind of things we should be stating, so we can share that with our members. What kind of things should we be having them submit when they're making their comments on this impact assessment scenario for Tent Mountain?
I can jump in on that one. I think the important thing when looking at that is highlighting the areas of federal jurisdiction, and so those are fish and fish habitat, water quality, Indigenous, treaty and Indigenous or Aboriginal and treaty rights, transboundary issues.
Okay.
Those are the things that the feds are going to look at, because those are the things that they have decision-making power about.
Okay.
So when we can look at, we submitted extensive comments along with the Livingston Landowners Group and the Niitsitapi Water Protectors and Eco Justice, asking for the process to start for the designation of Tent Mountain. We can maybe put together our
Like a list of
high level,
points?
talking points, arguments of why we think that it needs a federal impact assessment, and get that to you, that you can.
This is kind of the list that we'd already established. I'm curious about fisheries and oceans, and the whole idea that the stuff would have to go to the Port of Vancouver and would need approval to leave from the Port of Vancouver, and all the extra shipping and all that kind of stuff. Is that something that we could be addressing as well? Because from what I understand, and I could be wrong, because there is yet no approval to start shipping this stuff out of the West Coast.
It's not, it is something to consider, but it's not likely something that the impact assessment agency is going to actually look at based on the scope of the project. So, I mean, feel free to talk about it, but it's not going to be a high priority for them,
right,
as far as their decision making.
I was just thinking that given the transportation issues because of climate change issues and the whole shipping of everything across, are we going to try and exacerbate that? But I was also going to try and focus on the idea that it doesn't matter where we burn it, it's still carbon emissions. So shipping it across the world doesn't necessarily absolve us of any responsibility for that material. So, okay. If anybody's got talking points, they can share them with me in the chat and I'll copy and paste them, or send me a message on the Facebook page and we'll get something posted tomorrow and see how much stuff we can get put onto the impact assessment page.
Yeah, we'll follow up with you tomorrow, Laura. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Perfect. You've already muted yourself. Wonderful. Look forward to following up and providing information so that you can share it with that amazing Facebook page. I am going to go to one more question out loud, and then if there's not too many more, I will go into the Q&A box. So Sherry, I just saw that you had your hand up, and I'm going to allow you to talk and ask the question.
Thank you, Tara. I guess because I was one of the attendees at the panel discussion today, I was very curious as to what the format would be for their planning phase. It was it was actually pretty interesting. They said that we all have until December 16th to put in, I guess, our opposition to the designation of Tent Mountain mine redevelopment. Something very interesting that one of the attendees had asked was, why are they calling it an expansion when the actual mine itself is inactive? And related to that, because they're actually considering a new plant, and as well as a plant operation that would actually occur in 3 years. So I don't understand how they can make all of these deliberations or even request a designation when the impact assessment would take up to 3 years for this potential impact, and whether or not we have, I guess, all the information, because they didn't really have any of the ESGs, which are the environmental, social, and governance targets. Like, there was very little information, there was very little data. They had a 2-page, I guess you want to call it OM, or sorry, an MO of what they were planning on doing, but there was just very little information in regards to that. And my direct question to Peter Doyle, who is the managing director since January 2018, was one of his former companies, Glencore, has has actually been campaigned against by activists, and they were wondering why they just don't let go of these fossil fuel pollutants, as in the coal industry, and just sell off these assets. So it's an interesting situation because they've got very little data on how this is going to take place. So I'm just curious as to anybody else who had been at that discussion as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. So yeah, I mean, there is a process. This process, or this period right now, is the project description process, where the IAAC and the public looks at the project description, and based on that, they will assess whether it needs a federal impact assessment. And so this sort of, and then, you know, there are stages and stages after that that people can put comments in, including leading up to a hearing, an environmental impact assessment in the middle. So this is really the very start of the environmental impact assessment process. That said, I think one of our concerns is because that the minister made that statement earlier in this year that all future metallurgic coal mines would require a federal impact assessment. But the session today really is raising questions for me of what that actually means if now they are just pumping them into this first process of deciding again whether it needs one. So I think we do need to continue to push on that piece. There was a lot in what you said, but hopefully that answers the main thrust of your question.
Thanks, Katie. And Sherry, I hope that's answered your question. I'm just gonna put you on mute now. You can always raise your hand again if you have anything else you'd like to add. I'm gonna go to a question from the Q&A box now, from Dave Baines. Chris has said he'd like to answer it. The question is, how long did the other land use plans in Alberta get completed? I imagine that means take to get completed. If it's a long time, we'll need something in place while we do land use planning for the eastern slopes.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So in Alberta, our current sort of regional land use planning process started with the passing of the Alberta Land Stewardship Act in 2008. From that, there was 7 regional zones that Alberta was divided into based upon the major watersheds in the province. So I can also speak to Robert Wild's question there, where to what degree have you included watershed perspectives in land use planning? The regional land use plans in Alberta are actually based upon our major watersheds. So everything about them is really tied to the boundaries of those greater watersheds. And it's one of the overriding components that these plans are trying to help manage. So currently, of those 7 regional plans that have been supposed to be drafted since 2008, one was completed in 2012, the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, and a second one was completed in 2014 with a few revisions and subsequent years with the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. With that leaves us with 5 regional plans that still have not been completed since 20, that's almost 15 years now. The North Saskatchewan Regional Plan sort of stalled out in 2014, and a draft was released in 2018, and that's as far as it's gone. And we haven't heard any new updates on the other 4 regional plans. So basically, it's only 2. It takes a really long time, and we absolutely agree. Right now, there's large gaps in our regulatory process and our sort of overarching guiding frameworks throughout Alberta because it's taking so long to get these regional plans in place. This has been a problem under multiple governments, and seems to be an issue that's really easy for subsequent governments to kind of kick down the road and not really fully address. But we're seeing the problems that happen when you continue to do that, in that you run into regulatory uncertainty, and you run into issues like this, where when the coal policy was rescinded, there really was no other overarching guidance for the landscapes in these areas without going back to plans that were in some cases 40, 50 years old. So really out of date. So yes, we do need something in place while we do these this land use planning for the eastern slopes. And that is essentially what we've proposed with our kind of people's Alberta coal or a replacement coal policy that would see sort of almost essentially a coal moratorium or an end to coal mining on the eastern slopes as we develop these plans to manage them into the future. I hope that answers your question.
Katie, did you have anything to add?
Other than the fact that, you know, even though the Saskatchewan regional plan is in place, it does not have the planning at the scale required to look at the cumulative effects of coal mining and everything else on that landscape. It also did not specifically address coal in the entire conversation and the development of that plan. I was involved in probably every single conversation in the development of the South Saskatchewan regional plan, and we never once talked about coal development. So I think, as Chris said, there are major gaps in our land use planning process that would address coal, which is why we need a coal policy now to address the issue of coal and essentially ban any future coal development. And then we can deal with the rest of the cumulative effects on this really busy landscape through land use planning.
Thanks to both Katie and Chris there for those answers. I really appreciate it. I see we've still got a number coming in our question and answer, and there's been lots of typed out answers flagged in the Q&A box, so I encourage people to read there as well. We're going to go to Richard Mary. I see he has his hand raised. Richard, I'm going to allow you to talk and ask a question.
Unmute. Can you hear me all right now?
We can hear you. Thanks, Richard.
Yes, I still have a few signs left, by the way, from the Defend Alberta Parks. So I want to get back to someday. Anyways, you know, I'm always trying to find a niche here as a member of the Edmonton chapter of the Council of Canadians. You know, and I've sort of decided to spend more time on the thermal coal, and you know, they're all intertwined, and of course, thermal coal and met coal. But and so I've decided to kind of focus on the Vista coal mine. Now I heard Katie earlier saying, well, it's kind of been taken care of through the federal level through an assessment, I guess, including a review panel. Is that correct?
Chris or Tara are probably actually better to directly address Vista.
Okay. All right, either Chris or Katie, but so I'm not sure what the status of that you know, interaction between the feds and the Vista coal mine near Hinton is at. Could you clarify that, Chris?
It's actually been a bit since I've seen any updates on the Vista project. Trying to think now.
I can jump in there, Richard. I guess if they decide to proceed, they still have to now submit a tailored impact statement and a public participation plan. And we are currently waiting to see if Vista is going to submit that to the federal government to proceed. However, the two federal statements that have recently been made on thermal coal mean that they're very unlikely to be allowed to move forward with that expansion. So I guess the short answer is we're in this weird limbo right now. But as soon as there is any action, if there is any action on that, we will be we'll be letting the public know through our newsletter, our social media channels, if there's any opportunity for public input. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I could go on here, but there's other people I know. But I went to the impact assessment public discussion today, and I learned a few things about the process. And there's a planning stage, and that's going till the 15th on the Tent Mountain. But as far as, so you're saying they're still in the planning stage, trying to decide whether they're going to have an impact assessment for the Vista coal mine?
They're not even in that stage yet.
They're not even in the planning stage yet.
I think they're still waiting to submit early things, and now I'm getting a little.
2 phases. Okay. All right. Well, I'm wanting to do something on it, and I think, it hasn't been in the media, obviously, the Eastern Slopes and the met coal and all that, and we worked on that, last year and a half. I've been in the media, but this isn't, so we thought about doing some kind of a Zoom to educate people over the next 2 or 3 months, but that's why I'm asking your advice on that. And it sounds like just wait and see where the assessment goes first before attacking that. It kind of looks like it's the first domino, sort of like, like Grassy Mountain was kind of the first domino, and it was kind of defeated as far as we know. But that's kind of the way I'm looking at Vista. It's kind of the first domino. It's the biggest project in the thermal coal application process. But so yeah, I don't know. I'll keep in touch with your website, and unless anybody else has anything to say, I want to get a sense of
Yeah.
it.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I can connect with you if I'll send you my email address, although I'm pretty sure you have it. And I can send you the information that we do have, and you can be the first to know if we hear anything further on that.
Thank you, Tara.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to put you back on mute now. Okay, we've got 2 questions in the Q&A. Laura, I see your question there that says, was that the NDP or before that? But I'm unsure about what that was in reference to. So I'm going to let you put that in the chat or re-enter your question. I see one that has come here from Timothy. It says, after listening to everybody speak, I feel like I have a lot to learn about this issue. What are the best ways for me to bring myself up to speed? Katie, would you like to answer that?
Well, one of the places that I would direct folks to start with is a page that we CPAWS and Livingston Landowners Group run with the support of a number of other organizations called Albertans for a Coal-Free Rockies, and maybe someone can throw that as an answer in the chat. Yep, thank you, Kira. And that we've tried to sort of give an overview, as well as through various blog posts give updates as things are happening, and then of course following our social media, following our newsletter, as well as other organizations like the Livingston Landowners, like the Pikisco group, that are really actively engaged, and the Facebook page that Laura, who previously spoke, administers, which is, someone is going to have to remind me of the name of it because it's kind of long. Thank you. Protect Alberta's Rockies and Headwaters. All of those are great to keep up to date. The folks on the Facebook page are often on issues and announcements before we have a chance to put things out, and then we often take a little bit deeper dive and give the policy and science context. So that would be my suggestions. I know it's a little bit self-promoting, but there are a lot of groups working on this issue, and it can be hard to sort of weed through all the information out there. Anyone else? Chris, I see there's other folks throwing references in the chat, so that's great.
Kira wanted to also add to that. So Kira, do you have any comments to add there?
Oh, sorry. No, I was just marking the question as being answered live. But yes, Albertan for Coal-Free Rockies, great resource, and we are trying our best to continuously update it with relevant information. So yeah, that would be my main source to go to as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Kira. Well, I'm going to move on to a question here from Mike. The question is, a big issue has been the protection of certain species of fish. What is causing the endangerment of these species? Does not the mitigation, planning, and reclamation of Grassy Mine provide a solution, plus have an economic benefit? For the record, I'm for sound environmental economic resource development. Cheers. Katie, you love trout.
I do love trout.
Do you like to talk about trout?
I always want to talk about trout. Yeah, and for the record, we are also for sound environmental economic development, but it does need to be sound and environmental, not just twisted that way. And I think, particularly with our threatened native trout, these are species that are really down to the last of the last of their remaining habitat, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it was historical, over harvest or accidental harvest. Some of it is hybridization. Some of it is changes in habitat. So, and I think that is the really big piece. Habitat loss is and continues to be a major barrier for the recovery of these species and contributions to the continued decline of these species. And so when you're talking something like coal mining, that from the exploration stage to the development phase places a massive risk to the quality of the water that these fish in. They need cold, clean, connected water streams. So when you change any of those things, they have a lot of trouble surviving. And like I said, they're down to the last of the last. And so they can't take any more threats to their habitat. And particularly for Grassy Mountain was going to wipe out critical habitat for West Slope cutthroat trout. And there is not an easy way to just replace that somewhere else. The sort of offsetting plans often are not successful. And especially when you are down to just these last bits of habitat. So Grassy Mountain absolutely was going to decrease habitat available for that species. And I think all the exploration and development activity that's happening or could happen really pose an additional threat to these species. So I don't think there is a win for native trout anywhere in this coal conversation. I think there's only potential for losses for those species. And then, those losses translate not just to the loss of those species, but when you talk about economic development, there are a lot of people, businesses, industries that rely on having those fish species and having that clean water. And so it's a trade-off of economy for economy. And I think we need to look at the outcome of the Grassy Mountain decision, where they said that trade-off was a low economic benefit for really high risk and potential loss for these species and for water quality, and look long-term about what that economic trade-off is.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate it. Your answer, and you're talking about trout. I'm just going to check in. Laura, you still have your hand up. Did you want to ask another question? Nope. Okay. And Richard, same goes for you. Your hand is still up. Did you want to ask another question? Maybe I'm just gonna.
No, sorry, I forgot to put my hand down, but no, I'm done.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And maybe, we've got some things going on in the Q&A box. We're actually out of questions in the Q&A box. So does anyone have any further questions? Please raise your hand, pop them in there. We did have a couple other questions that came in. So
Tara, I think I saw a hand go up.
Oh, right.
New hand go up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sandy, I think.
Yes, Sandy, we're going to allow you to talk and ask a question. You should be unmuted.
Unmute, whoops.
There you
Unmuted,
are.
am I on? Okay. Hi, thanks for taking my question, for this opportunity to listen to what's current. I started watching this issue some months ago. I had an interruption, so my question may have been answered way back when. But in terms of this impact assessment agency, and I've heard it talked about since the onset, well, since the 1976 policy was struck down, that these new developments or the opening of older developments are not required to have an impact assessment at a provincial level. Is that correct? Is my assumption correct?
No, they would all need, yeah, I can't imagine any of them would not need a provincial assessment. So they all would require a provincial assessment. The thing with having a federal assessment, it adds another layer of rigor to the assessment, and another layer, I think, of how the public interest is viewed. I think, you know, despite the Grassy Mountain decision, the AER doesn't, the Alberta Environmental Regulator, which would be the body making the decision at the provincial level, doesn't have a lot of public trust to make decisions in the public interest. So when that gets bumped up to also being accountable at the federal level, I think those public interest questions and those federal jurisdiction questions have additional scrutiny and additional ability for the public to convey their concerns or, you know, support if that was the case.
Okay, that makes sense. I did some work some years ago on oil and gas in terms of dealing with the provincial government and the impact studies they did back then, and that's too long ago to talk about, but the AER is not invested in public interest, in my opinion. But moving on to the federal agency, what stands in the way of just having a broad spectrum? Okay, if you're going to disturb the environment, you must, all projects must have an impact assessment. I know that sounds a little naive to ask that question, but it seems to me it's so very basic. Why are they looking at each one saying, does this one need it? Does that one not? If you're going to blow up a mountain, it would seem an impact study would be appropriate.
Yeah, I don't think that's a naive question. I think part of what it falls into is federal versus provincial jurisdiction, right? So they would all require provincial assessment because, you know, they're blowing up a mountain. It would require, you know, someone to look at that, the environmental impacts of that. In Canada, natural resource management is under the jurisdiction of the province, and then there are certain pieces like water quality, like species at risk, climate, that are under federal jurisdiction. So the feds can't just come in and say, hey, province, we don't like this, we're going to take over your jurisdiction. I don't think the provinces would take too kindly to that. So there is that distinction. So either way, they will need impact assessments. It's just whether they fall under federal jurisdiction and whether the feds have a chance to, or the feds have jurisdiction and need to be involved. And that's what the previous to the minister's statement that every new metallurgic mine would need a federal impact assessment. That's the process that it look like. If a case could be made that there was impact to federal areas of federal jurisdiction, then the feds would get involved. So I think it seems like that is now still the process, despite the statement the minister made. But it's complicated. But it is very clear on lines of who has control over what decision making.
Okay, well, I find myself frustrated because I think back in the conversation, not frustrated with our conversation here, but with the process, is that there still seems to be, the federal government is still not just saying they're still trying to decide whether there should be an impact assessment based on those three issues you mentioned. That's where the federal government is right now.
Correct. For each individual mine, it seems now they will, and that's how it was previously, each individual mine, they decide whether they think there will be impacts to those areas of federal jurisdiction. And if they say, nope, it's not going to have impact to species at risk, or fish and fish habitat, water concerns, climate, transboundary issues, some of these things that fall under the feds, then they would say, no, we don't need to be involved. The province can handle this, because they don't actually have the power to make those decisions. So that, yeah, that is what they decide on a case-by-case basis whether they think there will be impact.
So I'm asking the last part question so others can ask their questions. So we have to polish up our crystal ball to see if the federal government in their wisdom sees what we've already seen on several of these projects, that yes, those three things will be affected. I mean, it seems so obvious to me. I feel embarrassed asking the question.
I think there is a high.
It?
No, I think there is a high chance that a federal assessment will be needed for any new coal mine. And I don't think it's just a crystal ball. I think it is letting our elected representatives and letting the impact assessment agency through their call for public input know that we do think that that it affects these three areas and why.
Okay, well, maybe that's the next agency I should write, because I've already given my 2 cents to the provincial government.
It probably is, and maybe someone can throw that link to that input back into the chat for Sandy.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you very much, Sandy. We appreciate your participation and your willingness to write agencies and your elected representatives. I'm going to put you back on mute now and lower your hand. Okay, I see Sherry has a question. I'm going to ask you to unmute and you can direct your question. There you go.
Yeah, just to Chris, because he was really the lone person standing up for our watersheds at the recent public hearing with the City Council in Edmonton. And I know a similar action took place in Calgary. And Chris, was really giving very pointed advice when they said, when the city councilors themselves, and this was pre-election, so way back in August, on August 27th. And I'm just really curious as to how the municipalities would also be dealing with this information, because there is a bit of a trickle down effect, I'm pretty sure. And this is a new council, both in Calgary and Edmonton. And have we put together any kind of opportunity to put some voices or even just create some hype about this to our council, those especially who would be, I guess, amenable to listening to how coal would affect our municipalities? And if that isn't an action that can be supported.
Yeah, so I can definitely talk to that. So for in terms of, I guess, things that came out of that meeting with the City of Edmonton's Utility Commission back in August, there was a commitment made that the mayor, on behalf of City Council, would write a letter advocating to the provincial government as part of the provincial coal policy review to express the importance of the potential serious impact of coal mining on our regional watershed and ecosystems. Unfortunately, right after all that was decided, we had municipal elections, the mayor of Edmonton changed. And so since then, that kind of deliverable is still outstanding. I have followed up with the city clerk for the city of Edmonton a number of times since then, and they have still not heard back from the mayor's office. So we are still working on getting the city to write the letter they said they would and submit. But ideally before the December 31st report is released. But even if not, it is still a the bureaucracy within the city of Edmonton is still aware of the issues. We've presented to, I think at this point, about at least more than a dozen municipalities in the North Saskatchewan watershed region. Everything from Drayton Valley to Devon to the city of Edmonton itself and to a lot of the other outlying communities. So even though the elected representatives might not have seen us present in all of these, a lot of the bureaucrats in charge of bringing councillors up to speed are aware of what's been going on. So in terms of how we could, I don't know, put more pressure on our elected representatives or create more awareness, I feel like a lot of this is going to come in the new year in 2022 once the Coal Policy Committee has released their recommendations. I think between now and then, there's not a lot that realistically could happen with Christmas coming up and the December holidays. And there will be a lot more to engage with councillors on once that report is released. So I think kind of early in the new year will be the best opportunity, depending on what the recommendations the Coal Policy Committee's report contain would be the next best opportunity to re-engage with your councillors on the importance of this issue.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. I don't want to take up too much time here. Somebody just put in the chat, which was really appropriate, actually. Thank you. I think it was Timothy. And essentially that a number of the climate mitigation requirements, we're still sort of wondering if that's an effective thing to be doing. And because most of these mines have reclamation, so would it be important to campaign on I guess, whether or not a climate change plan is in place. And if that's not something that they have, can we actually say, well, you know, we're doing all this public engagement, and if we haven't had a discussion about what are the mitigation if we do have an excessive an event, so if that tailings pond actually overflows, what are the options? Do we pick up the fish like they did in Sphinx River and reroute them into where they could have actual clean water? So, I mean, I guess my question is there's a lot of inactivity that I'm worried about. Inactivity as in they're waiting to do something because the Coal Policy Committee hasn't come up with anything to let us know what's happening. We haven't had an interim report. We haven't even been given in an influx of information. It's just a waiting game. And so I guess my curiosity is just getting to me right now, but I'm hoping that we'll hear something soon.
You're not alone, Sherry. Thanks so much. Okay, we are running out of time. Well, we've got about another 20 minutes. So I am going to let the last two people who have their hands raised answer questions. And out loud, I'll get Dick to ask a question first, and then Carmen. And then any other questions that go into the Q&A box, my colleagues will answer and type the answers into there. And then we'll close up. So if you have any last final questions, either raise your hand or get them in the Q&A box. So Dick, I'm going to ask you to unmute now.
I'm trying to unmute here.
We can hear you now.
Okay. I'm calling from Blairmore. I grew up within sight of Grassy Mountain, watched the operation up there until 1955 when the mines were shut down. I've been following this coal policy committee, and right from the outset, it's been my impression that this committee has made up its mind already. It's been, the membership is totally skewed against anything in terms of coal development is concerned. The membership is a large portion of it, from I gather, is ranchers and farmers on the east of the eastern slopes of the Rockies. And I guess my advice to them is just be careful what you wish for here, because if environmental groups such as yourselves are successful in shutting down these coal mines, the next people to have targets on their backs are going to be the ranchers and the farmers, because they are every bit as responsible, if not more, from putting foreign objects, fertilizers, feces, that kind of thing into our watersheds. And the watershed from the mine.
Sorry, Dick, I'm just going to interrupt you. Do you have a question?
Well, I've got a question as to
Okay.
why this coal policy committee seems to already have its mind made up. An inflammatory language seems to be a part of it. Katie just a few minutes ago used the phrase "blow up a mountain." Well, a mountain is not going to be removed. The amount of land taken up by this coal mine is, if you had a farm, it'd be about the same proportion as a dog digging a hole for a bone. There's thousands, if not millions, of acres of eastern slopes, and to come along and say we're going to blow up a mountain is just inflammatory. The minimum.
Okay, thanks, Dick. Maybe
Okay.
we'll let the
But
panelists answer your question.
Their conclusion about a minimum economic comment impact here is just ridiculous. There's not a single environmental job that I have ever seen that is going to bring in $100,000 a year, where these mining jobs will be, and it's going to be a huge economic advantage for this area. But of course, anybody that's not living in the area really doesn't care very much about that. Okay, that's my comment.
So not entirely a question. However, perhaps initially we'll comment that none of us are on the coal policy committee. But perhaps, Katie, did you want to answer with regards to the input to the coal policy committee that is publicly available from experts and residents and Albertans?
Yeah, I mean, there was some inflammatory language there, but I think we don't know what the coal policy committee is going to come out with. We know that they were appointed by the Minister of Energy from all different walks of life. And so I would encourage people to look into the backgrounds of all those folks rather than going based off rumor. And I think when you look at what the coal policy committee, or what people submitted to the coal policy committee, and we've reviewed that very thoroughly, the vast majority of that input from Albertans is that they don't want new coal mines because of the huge risks to environment and economy and communities. And I think we do need to look at the future of coal, previous coal towns like Crow's Nest Pass, and create sustainable economies for those going forward. But we're not going to be doing that by repeating the past and causing more and more damage both to those environments and those communities.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you, Dick, for participating and sharing your question. Okay, so with that, I'm going to bring us to one final question from Carmen, who's been patiently awaiting with her hand up. Again, we've had lots and lots of questions go in through the Q&A box. If you're looking for answers to other questions that you've seen, they've all been typed out there. So Carmen, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
So with Canada and Alberta having the highest environmental standards in the world, why wouldn't we be better off developing our resources here responsibly versus another country that wouldn't be doing it as responsible as Canada?
Thank you for the question. I see that Katie has unmuted and is willing to answer that one.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think what we need to consider is not just the standards, but whether companies can meet those standards. And I think particularly when we've talked, when we look at, you know, selenium contamination, something like loss of native trout, some of the issues highlighted by the Grassy Mountain project, but also a high risk of all these other projects. We see that companies actually cannot meet those standards, and those standards are not even enough to protect some of the water quality and some of those species. And so if we are looking at still having massive impacts to our water quality, to our downstream water use, to the species at risk and the wildlife that we value here in Canada, it's a question of making a decision based on those impacts, and we know that those based on studies, based on experience of other mines, based on the what is being put forward by the mining companies, that there will be massive impacts or a very high risk of those massive impacts, and we can make those decisions and say we're not willing to take those risks and look at that. I mean, there are just some places that are not appropriate for certain developments, and I think the eastern slopes of Alberta is a place that is not appropriate for coal mining.
Thanks so much, Katie. We have.
I'm not finished yet. So
sorry,
I don't
sorry,
understand.
Carmen.
Why would you guys be making the assumption that these companies wouldn't be able to meet those standards? I mean, they have to follow the Coal Conservation Act, the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, the Public Lands Act, the Water Act, the Mines and Minerals Act, and you're not taking into any consideration about legacy mining, which is what has happened with Teck. And they're over 95% right now of cleaning up the selenium.
I mean, we know that Teck hasn't been able to control their selenium problem, nor have we seen that mines in the Hinton area have been able to control their selenium issues. There are potential new technologies coming on board, but those aren't proven at the scale of an operating mine. And so I think what we're saying and what a lot of Albertans are saying is that risk is too high. This is our water source that we're talking about, and that while we might try some things and they might work, that we're not willing to take that really massive risk based on what we've seen in the Elk Valley, based on what we've seen in Hinton, and based on what we've seen of what the viability of these new mitigation measures are. It's a question of risk, and I think we're just not willing to take that risk.
Thanks for answering that, Katie, and thanks for your follow-up there question, Carmen. So we've reached the end of our question and answer period. Before I let the panelists go, I would just like to get them to quickly comment on just what we can expect provincially post Coal Policy Committee submission of the report regarding consultation and further public participation on a provincial coal policy, and just how people can stay in touch with us here to follow up. So perhaps Katie or Hira would like to jump in and ask that, and then we'll wrap up.
Sorry, press the wrong button. Yeah, I mean, I think we now expect the documents or the reports from the coal engagement or the coal policy committee to go to the Minister of Energy December 31st. And so I think starting January, we need to be asking the Minister of Energy to release those to the public. I think we need to also be able to see what the coal committee says is of what they heard from their engagement and what their recommendations are. So that's a first thing, really trying to be able to get those reports. Making clear to the government, to the provincial government, what we expect from a coal policy, that whether or not is reflected in the coal policy committee's reports. You know, as I mentioned, they did a pretty thorough, I think, we'll have to see in their what we heard document, stakeholder engagement, but there's still not been a public consultation on this. And so I think we need to push the provincial government to do a public consultation before they draft any new coal policy. And then based on that, I think we can expect in the new year or hopefully in the new year, the government to actually draft a new coal policy that reflects what they've heard from the Alberta public and what the best available science says that the potential impacts are and how that translates to how we manage our landscape. Kira, do you want to talk about anything else about how we're going to keep folks updated or how they stay in touch with us?
Sorry, I had to find my button there. Yeah, definitely. So one of the best ways that folks can stay updated is for sure heading over to the Albertans for a Coal-Free Rockies website. We're usually putting all of our recent news releases as well as other news pieces on there with lots of really great informational and educational resources as well. In addition to that, definitely, if you're interested, subscribe to our mailing list as well over with CPAWS Southern Alberta and with Northern Alberta chapters. If there is any ways that you guys can take action or stay engaged on the issue, we'll definitely be sending those alerts out to that mailing list. So yeah, for sure, if you ever have any questions on top of that, reach out to us as well. And we're always happy to guide you with further resources or yeah, wherever you can go to keep learning.
Awesome. I really, if you're on social media, I recommend following us there. We post lots of updates regularly, or like Kira said, subscribing to our newsletter. Maybe Kira and Elise, you could put our social media and newsletter signups in the chat as well. And then I'd just like to, sorry, Kira, can we pop to the last slide? Because I do want to quickly acknowledge that both of our organizations are nonprofit charitable organizations, and all of this work is only possible through generous support from local businesses all across the province, individuals, monthly donors, and we are very fortunate for this project to be supported by the Edmonton Community Foundation and Alberta Eco Trust, who've been supporting our coal research, input into the coal policy committee, and our ability to provide information to the public. So just a little plug for that, and immense amounts of gratitude to all of our CPAWS supporters. So with that, I'm gonna call the evening to a close. We are so grateful for everybody for participating, for engaging, asking questions out loud, and really digging into that Q&A box. Again, feel free to reach out to us through all of our digital platforms, and we're always happy to engage in conversation and answer questions. So thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate your time this evening.